Hi, I'm Tom Stephenson, and welcome to Construction Management Practices, our Intro to Construction Management course. And today we're going to be looking at capital costs and estimating. So this is lecture 5A, and then we'll be following that up with lecture 5B, which will be looking at the bidding and bonding processes. Okay, so let's get into it. So, learning outcomes. Today we're going to be looking at the essential elements of construction cost management. We'll be looking at life cycle costing and some of the processes involved in estimating. What's it about and who does it and why do we do it and what are our concerns about doing it. So capital costs in construction, that's the costs associated with building. And we have to think about when we're talking about construction, a lot of construction work is development. And development requires land acquisition. And land acquisition is of fundamental importance if you're going to be successful in the development industry. There's that old saying that build it and they will come. Well, if it's not in the right location, they may not come. That's why you also have the other term saying location, 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 right? So we have to look at the land acquisition cost, the cost of constructing buildings. There's two kind of things there, and deciding highest and best use. And I think we've talked about that in an earlier class. What is the highest and best use for this particular property? And if you figure that one out and then you build to it, then you're likely going to be very successful because you've capitalized on the best use for that particular property. In other words, if the best use is for it to remain a forest, you leave it alone and you don't buy it and let it just stay a forest. If the best use is instead of it being a farm, or how about downtown Toronto, instead of it being a warehouse like at King and Dufferin, if the highest and best use is to renovate that warehouse and make it into loft condominiums, or to tear down that warehouse and to make it into Liberty Village, that would be a highest and best use example. So there's all of those kind of things that go into it. This is actually a picture of the shipyards in Collingwood. And the reason I call it the shipyards is because going back over 100 years, it was the shipyards where they built ships that were sailing in Georgian Bay and the Great Lakes, and in World War II and World War I, they built ships for that. And of course, it was a brownfield site, so it was kind of contaminated. They had to excavate it. They had to remediate the soil. There's like almost like a mini hill off to the side. You can't see it over here. That is the contaminated soil that's been remediated, sitting there. And that's part of that sort of recycling process. And then, of course, where the houses are going, new fill was brought in. And the lake is right beside here, so it's very, very nice location. And it was right downtown Collingwood. Now, in Collingwood in its heyday, having the shipyards there, that was probably a good thing. But then times changed and it became more of a ski location. And then over time, it became a summer location with Georgian Bay there. And over time, it became like a four-season town and a lot of tourists, etc. So highest and best use isn't for it to be derelict and a brownfield site where the old shipyards were, and they went out of business because they couldn't make a business out of it anymore with all the international competition. So highest and best use says, let's change it. Let's make it into a development. Let's put in a bunch of townhouses and a bunch of condominium units and make it really nice and touristy for the area. And so that's what goes on with these types of projects. So a developer, Fram Developments, purchased it and over time has been developing these properties in there. So that's a good example of highest and best use. And I remember when I was doing consulting work with Mattamy Homes in training and development, one of their people from land development was saying, that they would look at about 100 properties very closely before they would buy a particular property, because if they make a mistake in the acquisition of the land, it pretty much sets them up to have trouble through the whole project to try to turn it around and actually do well on it. However, if they get the right property, it makes it a lot easier for them to make that into a profitable endeavor. The other thing with land acquisition, very often with all the regulatory requirements and the approvals requirements and the zoning requirements, you're looking at about a 10-year time horizon from when you buy that land till when it gets developed. This particular property here, it's been already like over 10 years that it's been in development. It's probably been about 12, 13 years in development, these little properties here. Another good example here too, this is on Yonge Street, just south of Cummer, north of Finch, and this was a small office building, and so it's coming down and ginormous condominiums are going in that space. Subway's just on the other side of this building, so it's a very good location for that. So when we think of the term life cycle costing, basically it's the cost of the building or structure over its life, right? There's the money to build a property, but then there's the money to actually maintain and run the property, which can be quite different. And so if you want to think about it, developers usually don't have to think too much about life cycle costing. You know, you build it, you sell it, there's usually a warranty period. In new house construction, it's a 7-year warranty period under the Tarion warranty program. It's a mandatory warranty program in Ontario. However, in commercial buildings and things like that, it might be a 1 or a 2-year warranty. So P3 projects, private-public partnerships, they often have where you design it, you build it, and you maintain it for 25 or 30 years. Well, I think you're going to design it a little bit different if you're going to be maintaining it for 25 or 30 years. So life cycle costing looks at the life cycle cost over its lifetime. So the costs of acquiring it, all of those costs, the costs of maintaining it, and the costs of operating it over its whole life. So you're talking about the build costs, the maintenance costs, the operational costs of that. And so you can understand that that's quite a different sort of number. And surprisingly, not too surprisingly, I guess, construction costs are like this much, right? And so the iceberg that they always say about the Titanic, it's much bigger underneath the water. And so that's usually the building life cycle costs. I think in another course I talk about First Canadian Place and the Carrera marble that was falling off of First Canadian Place, and it was falling like 40 floors onto the ground, very dangerous, and they had to reclad the building. It cost more to reclad the building than it cost to build the building. Of course, there was inflation and everything involved, but just to give you an idea, it's a pretty hefty cost to maintain buildings. So yeah, the capital costs, there's initial cost, the land acquisition, as we mentioned, construction costs, materials, equipment, all of these line items that you can see here, project management, supervision, testing and inspections, costs for regulatory authorities, permits, etc., feasibility studies, the design fees, financing costs, costs of bonds and insurance, and we'll talk about that in the second lecture, and costs of equipment and furnishing for building fit-ups. And there's other costs in between those ones too. So it's a pretty large area that we have to consider when we're constructing a project. Like demolition costs, I don't see demolition costs there. I could sit here and round out a few more of them pretty easily. And that's construction, right? So there's a lot of costs that are involved. So you have to really have looked at things carefully when you're a developer to make sure that you've got your P's and Q's in order, that you don't have any surprises, or at least any surprises that you didn't have contingency allowances for. So the operation and maintenance, just some of the line items here: periodic renovations, insurance, property tax, finance costs, utilities, marketing, number of those that come up. Design professionals, construction managers realize that while construction costs may be the single largest component of the capital costs, other cost components are not insignificant. Land acquisition, well, in Toronto, land acquisition can easily be more than the building cost itself. In some cases, that's why, you'll see people like my mother-in-law, she might say, oh, they tore down this house. It was, somebody paid $1.6 million for this house and they tore it down. Are they crazy? Well, it's the property that's worth 1.6 million, not the house. The house is actually kind of an inconvenience that it's there. So highest and best use is we get rid of this little bungalow and we put up a 4,000 square foot house, and maybe we could put that 4,000 square foot house up if it costs $300 a square foot. That would be 1.2 million for 4,000 square feet, and we paid 1.6 million for the property, so that's 1.6 plus 1.2, that's 2.8 million, and maybe we sell it for 3.4 million or 3.5 million, make a tidy little profit there. And what was more expensive? In that case, the land was more expensive. So that can easily happen, and very, very large costs that can be involved in that. Project cost management. So when we think about managing those costs, the estimating, budgeting. So we estimate the costs, we budget for the project. So estimating is trying to figure out if this is doable and what we can do it for, or if we're bidding on a project, what it's going to cost, including our overhead, including our profit margins, our target profit margins. And then budgeting is looking at, okay, so that amount that we can build it for, can we meet that budget or can we beat that budget? And then monitoring it as it's being built is trying to control the costs. There's these three levels that goes in. Cost budgeting is giving us a baseline that makes us, as we approach the project, we do two things. We do a cost baseline and we do a time baseline. So that would be our baseline schedule and our cost budget. And then we want to monitor both of these together as we're doing the build out for the project. And that's your cost control and project monitoring. So we have a construction estimate that forecasts the quantities, the cost of the project, and really cost estimation. Like if you mess it up, how do you fix it? You know, like you're in knee deep, you bought this land, you got the building halfway up, and you did a disaster on the estimate. Doesn't matter how good a project manager you are, you can't fix it. That's one of the reasons why estimating is so important. Just to give you an idea, well, I'll give you an idea I think in section B about that rather than now, of the bidding process. But a construction estimator is the professional who prepares the cost estimates, and you'll also hear the term quantity surveyors. So quantity surveyors and cost estimators. So you're an estimator, you're a quantity surveyor. And quantity surveyor, it's a designation that you can go after. You can be a CIQS and be a certified quantity surveyor, just like you can go after a project management designation where you go after a PMP, project management professionals. And we'll talk about that in another lecture with all the different certifications and designations that you can potentially go after. But quantity surveying is known as a profession. So quantity takeoffs, that's where we take the materials. That's where we get the takeoff of all the materials that we're going to use. That would be your quantity takeoffs. It's not including the labor yet, right? So quantity takeoffs, you're trying to take off volumes, linear footage of materials, areas of materials, and put that together with the costing of what they are. And that's, you know what, that's not the most difficult thing to do. The most difficult part of the estimating is pulling together all the labor rates to productivity rates and build numbers for actually constructing it. There's more variation in that than there is in the actual material price, especially if you can get locks on material pricing for so long from your suppliers. So, as I said, labor hours, labor rates, and you got moving targets going on. Different people work in different ways, and some are more productive than others. And so you have to do those takeoffs and that estimate of hours and expected productivity, and factor the work that you're doing. Like, is the drywall for 8-foot high walls, or is it for 10-foot high walls? And 10 foot's going to be more difficult than 8 foot, just because of the little bit extra height and reach that's required. So we think about material pricing, material prices. Sometimes we have issues with fluctuations in the market and pricing. Like this summer, the pressure treated lumber was very difficult to get because everybody wanted to build decks, and there were shortages of pressure treated lumber, and the prices went up through the roof. So those are good examples of where you have some variation and variability in the pricing of materials, and that can be problematic. You could have a trade war, and all of a sudden the price of steel goes through the roof for rebar going in concrete. We also have to estimate equipment costs, and what equipment are we going to need, and figuring out that we don't miss it, and do we have the right amount? Should we have more than one piece of these particular pieces of equipment? So if we're going to go with 2 cranes, well, there's extra costs in having 2 cranes, but there's probably also extra savings in having 2 cranes. And so if it makes sense from a business perspective to have 2 cranes, then that's what you should do. Those are kind of the thought process that have to go through the estimating side. That's where it gets more complicated. The estimating is figuring out how it fits in with the methodologies that's going to be used and the cost implications of different methodologies, and that can make or break you at being successful on a project. And then that has to integrate with the budgeting, which it has to integrate with the site work, and so there is this integration that has to occur. Whereas project management has a lot of iterations. Once you do your estimate, you're kind of stuck with that price when you start the project. It's not like you can reiterate the estimate. Now, you can look for budget savings in different places, but it's much more difficult to do. And you should do that always, but sometimes when you miss something, that puts you in a big hole. So you have to have subcontractor quotes. You have to allow for things like things that are non-value added, but you need them, like temporary power. You need to make sure that you're providing that it's easily accessible. Task lighting and area lighting, and who's paying for that, and how's that costed out, but it needs to be part and parcel. You got to have task lighting for when you're doing the work, because you don't have permanent lighting in place yet, and so forth. And you also have to think about indirect costs, overhead costs, permits, design fees, offices, like you see the trailers here that are actually, this is at Young and Bloor. It's a 100-story condominium project that's going up, and you've got site trailers because there's absolutely no space there, and there's a sidewalk that goes right underneath these trailers. They had to build out a pad so that the concrete trucks could sit on the pad, because there's no place to stage the delivery of the concrete, and then that had to be brought into the design of the overall condominium. So there's a lot of thought went into this, and that has to be all included in the pricing, or you're going to be paying a lot of money that you didn't include in the pricing, and that's going to sink you. So it's important for contractors, because if you don't do that, either you're going to be too high. That's the thing with estimating. You're either too high or too low. And then if you get it, you're wondering which one are you? You're wondering if you were too low. You generally, when you get a project, you start to wonder, was I too low on this one? Right? It's kind of a little bit of nerve-wracking when you do that, especially when it's your own business. You really don't know if you were too high until you actually do the project, and then you're going to find out. For owners, the estimate, they usually have preliminary estimates that they've worked on, and so they have an idea of what they're expecting the budget to be. At least professional owners do. Homeowners generally have no idea. You give them a price and they're having a heart attack in front of you. They think everything's going to be for free, in my experience. So you have to kind of, usually I try to give them some indication before I go to too much trouble pulling out a detailed estimate, because then I at least would get some feedback from them. If that's like crazy out of line, then I don't waste my time. But if you were, when you're dealing on larger projects, then it's much easier because they're professional and they know how that goes. And they have a budget for it. credible, reliable, accurate cost estimate needs to be established, and you need to make sure that the project's adequately financed and that there's no cost overruns during project execution. So you want to make sure that it's carefully managed and monitored. So really it's the process of determining the expected quantity costs, what materials do you need, how much, and the labor's costs. How much is the labor going to be to produce this, and the equipment costs. So usually what you're doing is you're pulling together a bunch of other costing, like your subcontractors, you're letting them come up with what's the electrical cost on this, what's the plumbing cost, what's the mechanical cost. And you, in larger companies, they have estimating teams that have a budget that they more or less see for what this is going to be, and they base that on historical experience. They base that on square footage costs using industry-wide collected data, RS means, etc. They produce quantity pricing and labor pricing for different jurisdictions in Canada and North America. And so that allows to come up with ballpark estimates. So then if somebody's out of line with it, then you can dig deeper. So that's what typically happens. And really it's the product of this whole process of going through those stages of pulling together different estimates, verifying the estimates, doing, if you're self-performing, your own costing, putting in your management fees, counting your overhead, and putting your target profit amounts on top. So as we were saying, they all start with a quantity takeoff, as we know, and that's taking off the materials. And so the quantity takeoffs, it's detailed measurements of quantities, understanding linear footage, areas, volumes. The math is not that complicated, but understanding what's in the drawings, properly interpreting the drawings, not missing items, is where we run into a lot of problems, I think. I think some estimators tend to think it's like this heavy-duty math. I've never thought of it as heavy-duty math. I've just thought of it as very detailed math, and you have to be very analytical with it, but it's not rocket science. Length times width times height. There you go. Length times width times height. So that's your volumes for concrete, and you just have to figure out. You just don't want to miss footings in your drawings. You don't want to miss count linear footage. That's usually where you run into these errors, is putting it together. So you usually want to have a system or process for doing your takeoffs that facilitates you not missing stuff. And then there's all kinds of checklists that are used by estimators to ensure that they don't miss major items. So quantity takeoff, it's tedious, time-consuming part of lump sum bidding, because you've got to be very careful. You got to really review the specifications. You got to review the drawings. One line in the specification could mean that you're estimating the wrong product. That's where you run into problems. You've got the wrong product, and you've got a quote on the wrong product, or you took a quote on the wrong product, and the difference between one product and another could be quite large. So we have to go through the project drawings, the project specifications, and all the project reports, and make sure that we have a good, complete understanding of the project, what the scope is. You got to have clarity on the scope if you're going to price the scope. How can you price something if you don't know what it is, right? So that's what you're trying to do. And of course, in drawings, there's all kinds of, when we get into commercial projects, there's all kinds of different numberings for drawings, whether it's site work, architectural, structural, mechanical, electrical, and you can sort of see the designation by the letter at the beginning, sort of giving you an understanding whether it's landscaping or site, civil, architectural, structural, etc. And the numbering system, page numbering systems. Of course, we can have BIM models, 3D models, and more we're starting to have quantity takeoffs from the models, so you can get volumes and areas that are much more accurate to be taken from the models when the models are done right. And that's one of the issues as we evolve with BIM, getting the models done correctly and having sort of a system to that too, just like we have with our 50 division format and 16 division format and specifications. So there's different types of estimates. The rough cost, you're trying to figure out, well, if you're a developer, you're trying to figure out, does this make sense? How much per square foot is it going to cost us to build this condominium, right? And how much are we going to be able to sell it per square foot or per square meter, whatever your measurement is? And is that difference going to allocate for us to make our profit targets? And then what's the risk level of something changing in the mix? Probably the construction costs are a little bit more understood than, say, market conditions with what you're able to sell the condominium units for. But even construction costs have been misaligned and misjudged, because maybe the condominium project, instead of taking 3 years to get built, takes 5 years, and then you've got inflation that's come into it, and maybe there was a down market, so you put those things together. That could be problematic in the condominium markets as well. So detailed, now you're really getting into the details, and you're using it for bidding. So there's basically bid drawings that were put out in a tendering process. You're bidding, going through the bidding process, and you're in the pursuit. They call it, you're in the pursuit of this work. It's interesting, some companies, when I was in Calgary, I thought it was really kind of nice the way that they would do it. So Bird, when they would win a bid, they would ring a bell, and everybody in the office would kind of cheer and, you know, celebrate that they won a bid. I thought that was a very sort of interesting process of getting the culture to work together more collaboratively and to appreciate the wins when they come, because you don't win every project, you know. And if you do win every project, then you got to start thinking, why am I winning every project? You know, am I pricing them too low, or are we going to be out of business? You win the right share of projects, and you hopefully win the projects that you're confident that you're going to be able to meet your profit targets on. There's nothing worse than winning a project that you're going to lose money on, because that kind of takes away from all the good work you do on other projects. You can have 3 really good projects, and then you have one project that's just a nightmare, and it takes away all your profit. Happens a lot in construction, happens too much in construction. So estimating is vitally important for those reasons. So we have the estimates for the contractors and subs. We normally prepare our estimates for the bids, and as I said, the GC is going to collect bids from the subcontractors. They're going to collate them, and then they're going to figure out which ones that are pre-qualified that they're going to use their bids, and then they're going to put that in their bid submission. And estimates for owners, very often that's helping them to decide, well, what's this new building at George Brown College going to cost? You know, before it's even, they actually get bids on it, they want to have a budget, because they got to see, well, can we do this? You don't want to do up a full set of detailed drawings and specifications put out for bid, and the cost of the waterfront campus comes in at $160 million, and you say, we only budgeted $60 million. Well, we can't do this, right? Not that that doesn't sometimes happen, but then that's, if you did a good preliminary estimate and the owner has that, then, and they use their own quantity surveyors, you can hire consultants to do that and to prepare that for you, then that gives you a realistic costing of what it should be. And then, so then if the quantity survey had given you sort of an estimate of 150 million, it comes in at 160. Okay, well, it's 10 million more, but it's in the ballpark, right? Owners still wouldn't be happy with it being 10 million more. So, but that's the way it goes sometimes. So that's what I wanted to cover in lecture 5A, and we'll be moving on to lecture 5B, which is the bidding and bonding process. So I hope you've enjoyed lecture 5A and the process of estimating. It is a vital part of the construction industry. It really is important. If you want to sink a project, throw in a lousy bid, and I'm guaranteeing you're going to sink the project. You'll probably get the project too. That's the other problem if you're pre-qualified. But that's what we're going to be talking about in the next one, is the pursuit of the project, the bidding process, and the bonding process. So it's Tom Stephenson signing off for now, and have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. Till next time.